In the quiet reaches of northern Britain, where the wind moves across heathered hills like an ancient breath, the first faint outlines of the Picts begin to emerge. Roman writers, watching from the edge of their vast empire, spoke of painted figures moving through mist-covered landscapes, a people defined by shadows rather than by pages of text. Their accounts offer only glimpses, fragments shaped as much by distance and fear as by observation. Yet even these fragments suggest a culture both formidable and elusive. Here in these northern territories, the past feels layered. Stones carved with undeciphered symbols, earth marked by forgotten fortresses, memory held in silence rather than inscription. The mystery is not merely that the Picts vanished, but that they left behind traces powerful enough to stir curiosity centuries later. How could a society capable of halting Rome slip so gently from recorded history? The tension between evidence and absence becomes the doorway into their world. As the landscape settles into dusk and ancient names fade into the folds of time, the question lingers softly: who were the Picts, and why did their voices fall quiet even as their symbols endured? Along the shifting frontier of Roman Britain, anxiety settled like a permanent haze. To the imperial mind, the world was meant to be ordered, measured, and charted, yet the lands stretching beyond their northern lines refused such containment. The construction of Hadrian's Wall marked Rome's architectural attempt to define the edge of its certainty. Stone by stone, it declared where empire ended and the unknown began. Patrols moved along its ramparts, watching the distant hills for figures they barely understood, while supply roads and frontier forts pulsed with the routines of an army stationed at the world's margin. Roman authors spoke of tribes beyond the wall, Caledonians, fierce and evasive, inhabiting landscapes that swallowed legions and confounded scouts. Early ethnographic descriptions portrayed them as both threat and curiosity, shaped as much by Roman expectations as by direct encounter. These accounts tell of swift resistance, elusive settlements, and tactics that unsettled even Rome's seasoned commanders. Yet for all the empire's discipline and record-keeping, their descriptions remain surprisingly thin. The Caledonians appeared only in brief entries, their lives glimpsed through the narrow lens of conflict, leaving more questions than clarity. The Antonine Wall, built farther north and abandoned within 2 decades, revealed the shifting confidence of Roman strategy. Intelligence networks attempted to map the people beyond, but reports remained vague, shaped by rumor and the uncomfortable realization that Rome's authority thinned quickly once its roads ended. Archaeology along these frontier lines shows the wear of constant tension. Forts expanded, watchtowers rebuilt, and garrisons rotated to maintain vigilance against adversaries who did not fight like Rome, nor live within structures familiar to Roman eyes. In this landscape, the earliest historical shadows of the Picts begin to form. Though not yet named, their predecessors challenged Roman assumptions simply by existing outside imperial patterns. They lived in dispersed communities, adapted fluidly to terrain, and engaged the empire on their own terms. The frontier became a zone of perception rather than understanding, where Rome's need for order confronted a culture uninterested in being catalogued. This raises a quiet but persistent question. How could an empire known for exhaustive documentation leave behind so little meaningful insight about a people living just beyond its northern wall? The gap between Roman certainty and northern reality becomes an essential context for the Pictish story. What Rome failed to describe would later emerge as one of the most enigmatic cultures in early medieval Europe, visible not through texts, but through stones, symbols, and the enduring silence of a world beyond the empire's reach. Long before the Picts carved their symbols into stone, the land they would one day inhabit was already marked by human intention. Across Scotland, Neolithic communities shaped the landscape with monuments whose presence still carries the weight of deep time. Chambered cairns rise from gentle slopes, their passages aligned with the movements of the sun. Henges, formed by earth and timber, once gathered communities for rituals now lost to memory. Stone circles, anchored in precise yet enigmatic designs, stand as quiet reminders of a world where sky, season, and ceremony were inseparable. These structures, scattered across moorland and island alike, reveal a cultural vision that reached beyond daily survival toward something more enduring. In these early landscapes, settled farming began to take hold. Fields of barley and wheat slowly replaced wild gathering, while domesticated animals altered patterns of movement and settlement. Archaeological layers show shifts in diet, technology, and community structure, but they also reveal continuities in how people related to place. The land was not merely occupied, it was shaped, honored, and inscribed with meaning. As centuries unfolded, these practices evolved, yet the impulse to leave markers, physical statements of belief and identity, persisted. When later communities emerged in the Iron Age, and eventually in the Pictish period, they inherited a landscape already rich with ancient memory. Though no direct lineage links Neolithic builders to Pictish artisans, the visual echoes are difficult to ignore. The stone carving traditions of the Picts, with their deliberate placement, symbolic forms, and enduring materiality, seem to resonate faintly with the monumental language of their prehistoric predecessors. This is not a claim of cultural descent, but an acknowledgement that the land itself carried a long history of inscription. Any group living upon it would have encountered the silent authority of stones older than recorded history. These ancient monuments remind us that the Picts did not emerge in an empty world. They stepped into landscapes shaped by millennia of human presence, where meaning had already been layered into hilltop, shoreline, and valley. Understanding this deep-time foundation helps situate the Picts not as an isolated mystery, but as part of a long continuum of people who marked Scotland's terrain with symbols, structures, and stories. The stones came first, standing before the Pictish kingdoms rose, and they ask a gentle question. Did the Picts inherit a landscape already inscribed with echoes of belief, memory, and human longing? In the quiet of these ancient sites, the answer feels both distant and ever-present. In the later centuries of Roman rule in Britain, a new word entered the imperial vocabulary, Picti. It appears in written sources of the 3rd century, sudden yet unexplained, as if a label could fix in place a people who refused to be contained. In the panegyric of Eumenius, the term is used almost casually, grouped alongside other northern foes, yet the choice of word has echoed through centuries. Picti is often translated as the painted ones, suggesting bodies marked with pigment or ink, figures whose skin itself became a declaration of identity. Other scholars have proposed that the term might evoke tattooing or even carry a more martial sense, hinting at the fighters. Whatever its precise nuance, the word almost certainly arose from Roman perception rather than native self-description. This raises a quiet but important distinction. To Rome, naming was an act of control, a way to situate unfamiliar peoples within familiar categories, allies, enemies, subjects, threats. Yet the communities described as Picti had their own languages, kinship structures, and internal names that have not survived in written form. What we call Picts may therefore represent a convergence of several related groups, filtered through imperial eyes. The label endures. The original self-designations have fallen silent. The question of language deepens the mystery. Surviving personal names, place names, and a handful of inscriptions suggest that Pictish may have been related to the Brittonic branch of Celtic, sharing features with the tongues spoken farther south in Britain. Some researchers argue for a P-Celtic language, structurally similar to early Welsh, while others see hints of an older, possibly non-Indo-European substrate beneath the Celtic layer. Fragmentary Ogham inscriptions in northern Scotland complicate the picture, offering sequences of characters that resist confident interpretation. Because no continuous texts in Pictish survive, scholars must work from scattered evidence, royal names in Irish annals, glosses in later manuscripts, and the linguistic archaeology of river names and ancient settlements. This kind of reconstruction is necessarily cautious, more a map of probabilities than a definitive grammar. The very uncertainty becomes part of the culture's profile. A people known by an outsider's label, speaking a language glimpsed only in fragments, occupies a liminal place between visibility and obscurity. How can a culture's true name be lost, replaced almost entirely by what others chose to call them? The emergence of Picti in Roman writing marks not the beginning of Pictish identity, but the moment when that identity brushed against an empire obsessed with classification. In that contact, a single Latin word took root in historical memory, while the names used in Pictish homes, gatherings, and rituals passed unrecorded. What remains to us is this borrowed designation and a set of linguistic traces, enough to suggest complexity, but not enough to restore the voices that once spoke beneath the painted or inscribed skin. In this tension between label and lived reality, the Picts first step into recorded history, not as silent, but as partially overheard their own words, receding while Rome's description remains. In the later centuries of the Iron Age, long before anyone spoke of Picts or painted peoples, northern Scotland was already a landscape of stone-built resilience. Rocks rose from coastal headlands and inland valleys, their thick drystone walls enclosing towers that combined defense, storage, and display. Around them clustered smaller structures, pens for animals, and working areas where daily life unfolded beneath the shadow of these monumental homes. Farther afield, hill forts crowned ridges and promontories, their ramparts tracing careful lines along the contours of the land, announcing control, protection, and perhaps prestige as much as military readiness. In the Northern Isles and along exposed coasts, wheelhouses and cellular buildings reveal another architectural tradition. Inward-looking, partitioned interiors arranged around a central hearth. These designs speak of communities adapted to wind, weather, and long winters, emphasizing warmth, enclosure, and continuity of occupation. Fortified farmsteads, scattered across lowland and upland zones, show that not all power was concentrated in massive forts. Much of it lay in kin-based units, extended households that managed crops, herds, and craft production within tightly bound social networks. Archaeology allows us to trace patterns in pottery styles, metal objects, and animal remains, building an indirect portrait of the people who inhabited these sites. Ceramic forms and decoration suggest regional styles, but also shared traditions, linking distant communities through similarity of practice. Iron and bronze working tools, weapons, decorative fittings point to skilled craftspeople whose knowledge circulated between settlements, carried perhaps by marriage ties, seasonal gatherings, or small-scale trade. Animal bones show mixed herding strategies, with cattle, sheep, pigs, and occasional horses reflecting a balanced approach to meat, traction, and status. Evidence for interregional trade appears in the form of exotic materials and occasional imports, hinting that even seemingly remote communities participated in wider economic webs. Yet most objects are local, born of nearby stone, clay, and ore, transformed through practiced hands into the tools and containers of everyday life. When we look across these sites collectively, rocks, hill forts, wheelhouses, farmsteads, a mosaic of Iron Age society emerges, decentralized, kin-focused, yet capable of organized labor and enduring construction. From this mosaic, certain themes begin to prefigure what would later be called Pictish culture, a preference for durable stone architecture, regional variation nested within broader shared patterns, and a habit of expressing identity through built environments rather than written records. The people themselves, their names and stories, remain elusive, but their choices left marks that resist erasure. When so much survives in stone, why do the inhabitants remain so hard to see? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the evidence. Archaeology preserves structures and objects more readily than voices and beliefs. What we hold today are fragments of a long prelude, an Iron Age groundwork upon which the Pictish world would eventually rise, already shaped by centuries of lived experience. Yet within these patterns of dwelling and exchange, complexity accumulated. Stories shared at feasts, loyalties negotiated, territories remembered, all carried forward in memory rather than ink, preparing the ground for later identities. When Rome turned its attention toward the northern reaches of Britain, it encountered not an empty frontier, but a network of resilient communities shaped by their landscapes and long accustomed to defending them. The governor Agricola, arriving in the late 1st century, sought to bring these territories under firmer Roman influence. Tacitus describes his campaigns with measured confidence, yet beneath the polished Latin prose lies a portrait of a region unwilling to yield. The march northward brought legions into contact with peoples who moved fluidly through hills, forests, and marshes, choosing when to confront and when to disappear. The Battle of Mons Graupius, recorded by Tacitus, stands as the symbolic climax of Agricola's northern push. Though the precise location remains debated, various scholars have proposed sites across Aberdeenshire and beyond. The narrative reflects a collision between imperial ambition and local determination. Tacitus presents a Roman victory, yet the aftermath offers no evidence of lasting control. No permanent occupation followed, and the tribes described in the battle's speeches continued to resist Roman designs. The silence of archaeology on a decisive confrontation only deepens the uncertainty, leaving open the possibility that the event was more rhetorical than transformative. As decades passed, Rome's frontier shifted repeatedly. The construction of the Antonine Wall farther north signaled imperial confidence, yet its abandonment after only a few decades suggested the limits of Roman endurance. Distant slabs from the wall commemorate building efforts with typical Roman formality, but they also mark the boundary of what Rome could realistically hold. Beyond these fortifications lay communities that did not conform to Roman expectations, dispersed settlements, mobile warriors, and seasonal strategies that offered no stable target. Intermittent warfare shaped the rhythm of contact. Raids, counter-raids, staged negotiations, and strategic withdrawals became part of the larger pattern. For the ancestors of the Picts, these encounters likely fostered a sense of shared threat, encouraging cooperation across regions that might otherwise have remained distinct. Resistance did not require a single central authority. Instead, it emerged from local knowledge, kinship alliances, and the ability to adapt rapidly to changing pressure. Diplomacy, too, played a role, with treaties and hostages forming temporary bridges between cultures that otherwise remained wary of each other. What emerges from this period is not simply a story of conflict, but one of identity crystallizing under pressure. The repeated failure of Rome to establish lasting rule in the north cannot be explained by terrain alone, though the landscape certainly offered advantages. Nor can tactics fully account for it, though local warriors knew how to stretch supply lines and exploit Roman vulnerabilities. Something deeper seems at work, a cultural coherence born of independence, memory, and the determination to remain outside imperial maps. Why did Rome never fully conquer the north? The answer lies in the interplay of land, strategy, and a resilient cultural spirit that refused assimilation. These centuries of contact forged a pattern of defiance that would later become a defining element of Pictish identity, a worldview shaped not by isolation, but by enduring, selective engagement with the greatest empire of its age. In the centuries following Rome's withdrawal from the northern frontier, the scattered communities of Iron Age Scotland began a slow and intricate process of political transformation. What had once been a patchwork of kin-based groups, fortified farmsteads, and regional power centers gradually coalesced into more recognizable polities. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Rhynie and Ardnamurchan reveals the rise of local elites who controlled specialized craft production, long-distance trade goods, and the authority to host large communal gatherings. These leaders likely formed the nuclei of early Pictish governance, nodes of influence that connected settlements across valleys, coasts, and uplands. Geography played a quiet but decisive role. Mountain ranges and rivers shaped territorial boundaries, encouraging the formation of regional identities while still allowing interregional exchange. Coastal zones offered access to maritime networks, connecting northern Scotland to Ireland, Britain, and even the wider North Atlantic. Over time, these interactions created pathways for political alliances, intermarriage, and the sharing of ritual practices, slowly weaving together communities that had previously been more autonomous. As authority expanded, certain centers emerged as focal points for decision-making and ceremonial display, anchoring early forms of kingship. The question of succession offers a distinctive insight into this evolving world. Medieval sources such as Bede's suggest that Pictish kingship sometimes passed through the maternal line, a detail that has generated significant scholarly debate. Some interpret this as evidence of matrilineal inheritance, while others argue for a more flexible system in which maternal descent played a notable but not exclusive role. Whatever the precise arrangement, the prominence of elite women within Pictish genealogies indicates that family networks were complex and strategically maintained. Marriages, alliances, and kinship obligations likely shaped political continuity as much as military strength or territorial control. Early annals referencing Pictish rulers portray a succession of kings whose reigns reveal both stability and competition. These texts, though sparse, suggest a landscape of shifting alliances where regional leaders vied for influence while still participating in a shared political framework. The absence of extensive written records makes the structure of Pictish governance difficult to reconstruct, but archaeology provides glimpses. High-status metalworking, imported goods, ceremonial feasting, and fortified enclosures all point to a society organized around authority that was both practical and symbolic. What emerges from these fragments is the early shape of a kingdom defined not by written laws or monumental inscriptions, but by relationships, landscapes, and the enduring medium of carved stone, the symbols etched into standing stones and boulders. Across the Pictish regions may have served as statements of lineage, territory, or ritual meaning, functioning as durable expressions of identity in a world where text was not the primary record. What kind of kingdom emerges when its stories are carved in stone, not written in manuscripts? The early Pictish polity appears as a network of communities knit together through geography, kinship, and shared traditions, an evolving structure whose resilience laid the foundation for the powerful kingdoms that would soon follow. The story of the Picts cannot be separated from the land they inhabited, for northern and eastern Scotland shaped their society as profoundly as any lineage or tradition. Along the rugged Aberdeenshire coast, cliffs met restless seas, forming natural strongholds where settlements overlooked long stretches of shoreline. Here, windswept promontories carried the cries of seabirds and the steady pulse of the North Sea, a constant reminder of both danger and opportunity. Inland, the fertile valleys of Strathmore unfolded in softer contours, offering rich soils for crops and pastures for livestock. These contrasting landscapes fostered diverse forms of life, yet together they formed the heartland of a culture that learned to thrive across varied terrain. To the north and west, the highlands rose in protective ridges, shaping travel routes and creating natural boundaries between communities. Their slopes sheltered pockets of settlement while limiting large-scale movement, encouraging strong local identities. Archaeological mapping reveals clusters of homes, farms, and hill forts aligned with these features, suggesting that the land itself served as a guide for political and social organization. Place name evidence supports this view, preserving echoes of early boundaries and reflecting a world in which territory was deeply tied to rivers, hills, and coastal markers. Rivers, winding through glens and lowlands, acted as both lifelines and spiritual corridors. They supported agriculture, facilitated travel, and offered natural divisions between regions. In the symbolic vocabulary of early Scotland, waterways held sacred significance, linking ancestral memory with ritual practice. Some Pictish stones stand near such river routes, their carved symbols watching over crossings and boundaries, marking spaces where the physical and spiritual worlds might have intertwined. Forests, too, played an essential role. Though the Great Caledonian forests had diminished since prehistoric times, woodlands still provided timber for building, fuel for hearths, and materials for tools and ritual objects. The presence of woodland animals in Pictish art hints at deeper associations, perhaps not literal representations, but symbolic reflections of environments that shaped identity. Forest edges, where light meets shadow, may have served as gathering places for ceremony or storytelling, spaces where community life unfolded with quiet continuity. Together, these landscapes created a realm that was both fragmented and unified. Each region held its own character, yet shared environmental rhythms connected them. The turning of seasons, the movement of herds, the cycles of planting and harvest. This balance of diversity and connection may help explain how Pictish culture maintained cohesion despite scattered settlements and challenging terrain. Communication followed river valleys, maritime routes, and passes through the hills, weaving together communities that otherwise might have remained isolated. How did a people living across such varied landscapes coordinate a cultural unity that endured for centuries? The answer lies in the interplay between environment and tradition. The Pictish heartlands offered not only resources and protection, but also a sense of rootedness, a shared experience of place that shaped identity as surely as politics or art. In this ancient and protective terrain, the Picts found both their strength and their enduring mystery. The language once spoken across Pictland lingers today only in fragments, faint echoes carried through carved stones, scattered names, and the uncertain memory of early medieval record keepers. Unlike Latin or Old Irish, Pictish left no surviving manuscripts, no continuous texts that could anchor its grammar or reveal its rhythms. Instead, scholars must piece together its shape from indirect traces, Ogham inscriptions found in northern Scotland, personal names preserved in the Annals of Ulster, and lists of Pictish kings recorded by later chroniclers. Each source offers a glimpse, but none supply the clarity required for certainty, leaving the language suspended between what can be known and what must remain conjecture. Ogham inscriptions, carved along the edges of stones, form the most tangible linguistic evidence, yet many are weathered, fragmentary, or carved in sequences that resist straightforward reading. Some seem to reflect names consistent with Celtic phonology, while others apt. Pair anomalous, hinting at structures not easily aligned with known Celtic languages. Personal names, too, of kings, nobles, and occasional figures mentioned in external chronicles show patterns that resemble Brittonic forms, suggesting that Pictish may have belonged to the P-Celtic branch alongside early Welsh and Cumbric. This view, supported by several linguistic analyses, proposes continuity between northern and southern Celtic-speaking regions of Britain. Yet alternative theories persist. Some researchers argue for a deeper pre-Celtic substrate underlying Pictish, pointing to elements that do not fit comfortably within Indo-European frameworks. These features might reflect an older linguistic layer absorbed during centuries of cultural interaction, or they may simply represent regional variations within Celtic itself. Because evidence is so limited, distinguishing between these possibilities remains difficult. The debate continues not from contradiction, but from the scarcity of data, an academic puzzle shaped as much by absence as by presence. The Pictish royal lists add another dimension. Names of rulers appear in forms that resemble Celtic constructions, although their precise meanings often elude translation. These lists, copied by later scribes whose own linguistic backgrounds influence spelling and interpretation, complicate the picture further. What appears Celtic may represent scribal adaptation rather than original linguistic form. In this uncertainty lies both frustration and fascination. What does it mean when a language survives only in fragments carved on stones? It suggests a world where writing was used sparingly, reserved perhaps for marking lineage, territory, or commemoration rather than for documenting speech. It also reminds us that literacy, as preserved through surviving texts, does not map evenly across all cultures. The Picts may have spoken fluently, sung, negotiated, and recited stories in a tongue now beyond recovery, leaving only the faintest traces of its existence. The puzzle of Pictish speech endures because each fragment, each Ogham line, each recorded name invites interpretation without allowing definitive answer. Scholars continue to debate, analyze, and speculate, drawn to a linguistic riddle that resists resolution. In these fragments, the voice of a people flickers at the edge of history, present enough to intrigue, yet distant enough to remain forever partially obscured. Across the landscapes of northern and eastern Scotland, carved stones rise from fields, churchyards, and windswept ridges, bearing symbols whose meanings have eluded explanation for more than a millennium. These stones, classified by scholars into three broad groups, form the most vivid material expression of Pictish identity. Class I stones, the earliest present-in-size symbols cut directly into undressed boulders, crescents and V-rods, double discs, Myriancombe motifs, and the enigmatic Z-rod. Class II stones, emerging later, blend these native symbols with Christian iconography, framing intricate crosses alongside warriors, beasts, and knotwork. Class III stones omit the classic symbols altogether, focusing instead on Christian themes while retaining the distinctive Pictish aesthetic. Together, these classes trace a visual tradition evolving across centuries, yet unified by enduring patterns of form and placement. The recurring symbols suggest a visual language, though its grammar remains hidden. The Pictish beast, with its elongated snout and curling contours, appears frequently enough to imply significant meaning, yet no certain interpretation has prevailed. It resembles no known animal, offering instead a stylized presence that invites speculation, perhaps mythic, perhaps emblematic, perhaps something entirely different. The Z-rod, often paired with weapons or geometric shapes, prompts theories about power, ritual, or broken lineage. The Myriancombe symbol has been linked to elite status or gendered identity, though such interpretations remain tentative. Each symbol hints at social structure, belief, or narrative, but none resolve into definitive understanding. Leading theories attempt to frame this symbolic system within familiar cultural models. Some scholars propose that the stones marked elite lineage, functioning as heraldic identifiers in a society that favored visual representation over text. Others suggest territorial or boundary markers, placed strategically to assert control over land or resources. Ritual interpretations envision the stones as objects mediating between the living and the ancestral world, their symbols carrying meanings tied to ceremony or cosmology. Still others consider narrative possibilities, imagining the stones as storytellers in stone, conveying myths, events, or genealogies in a symbolic script. Yet no single theory accounts for the full range of images, their variations, or their shifting contexts through time. What is clear is the level of skill and intention invested in these carvings. The precision of line, the balance of composition, and the consistency of motifs across vast distances imply shared training or widespread cultural coherence. Workshops may have circulated artisans among elite patrons, spreading stylistic conventions that reinforced a collective visual identity. Even when Christian themes entered the repertoire, the distinctive Pictish style persisted, suggesting an adaptability that preserved tradition while embracing change. Why would a culture invest so much effort in symbols whose meanings they never wrote down? the question lingers, inviting awe rather than frustration. These stones, silent yet expressive, reveal a society that communicated through enduring forms, trusting stone to carry meaning across generations. In their presence, we encounter both clarity of craftsmanship and opacity of message, a reminder that some traditions speak most powerfully through what they choose not to explain. Daily life in a Pictish community unfolded in rhythms shaped by land, season, and kinship. Archaeology from sites such as Rhynie and Burney reveals settlements composed of roundhouses gradually giving way to rectangular buildings, reflecting shifts in architectural preference and social organization. These structures were built from timber, turf, and stone, arranged around hearths that served as the literal and symbolic center of domestic life. Warmth, cooking, and storytelling all gathered around the fire, anchoring households in patterns that echoed across generations. Agriculture formed the foundation of survival. Fields of barley, supplemented by oats and occasional wheat, were cultivated with careful attention to weather and soil. Cattle, sheep, and pigs grazed on surrounding pasture, their bones appearing frequently in middens. Zooarchaeological studies from the Murray Firth region reveal balanced herding strategies that supported both daily nutrition and seasonal feasting. These middens, dense with animal remains, shells, and broken pottery, offer glimpses of social gatherings where food became a medium for reinforcing alliances, celebrating events, and sustaining community bonds. Craftworking, visible in the presence of spindle whorls, metal scraps, and fine bone tools, played an essential role in household and regional life. Textile production appears to have been widespread, with evidence of spinning and weaving suggesting that clothing and cloth held economic and symbolic value. Metalwork, from tools to ornaments, reflects skilled labor, perhaps concentrated in specific households or itinerant specialists. Such crafts not only met practical needs, but also reinforced social ties through the exchange of goods and the maintenance of local prestige. Kinship shaped the structure of these communities. Extended families lived in close proximity, and although the specifics of gender roles remain difficult to reconstruct, archaeological and historical clues point toward the presence of influential women. Their visibility in later succession narratives suggests that lineage, inheritance, and alliance may have involved maternal connections as well as paternal ones. Within households, responsibilities likely varied with age, skill, and season rather than rigid categories, reflecting a social world flexible enough to adapt to changing needs. Ritual practices intertwined with daily routines. While full ceremonies remain beyond reconstruction, certain objects, carefully deposited items, decorated stones, and the placement of structures suggest that spiritual meaning permeated ordinary spaces. Domestic life and ritual life were not sharply divided. Symbols of belief likely accompanied tasks of farming, crafting, and gathering. The landscape itself, with nearby rivers, hills, and woodland edges, offered settings for communal activities that blended work, worship, and social exchange. For all this material evidence, the Picts themselves remain elusive. Their spoken words, songs, and intimate stories have not survived, leaving archaeological traces to stand in their stead. Yet these traces reveal a society sustained not by mystery, but by the quiet persistence of everyday life. How did this ordinary world support a culture capable of resisting empires and shaping kingdoms? Through continuity of practice, strength of kinship, and the steady rhythms of labor and celebration. In the texture of domestic life, the foundations of Pictish resilience come into focus, grounding the extraordinary in the familiar. The figure of the warrior occupied a central place in Pictish society, woven into its structures of power, memory, and identity. Archaeological evidence from early historic sites reveals a martial world grounded not in grand arsenals, but in practical, versatile weaponry. Spearheads, the most commonly recovered implements, suggest a fighting tradition built around agility and coordination, where spears served both hunting and defense. Shields, likely crafted from wood and reinforced with iron fittings, complemented this approach, offering mobility rather than heavy fortification. Swords appear more rarely, their scarcity indicating that they were symbols of status as much as tools of combat, reserved for those whose rank or achievement set them apart. Artistic depictions carved into Pictish stones add another dimension to this warrior identity. Scenes of mounted fighters, arranged formations, and carefully rendered weapons do not resemble literal records of battle. Instead, they appear stylized, emphasizing posture, hierarchy, and symbolism over realism. Hunters and warriors alike are shown in composed, almost ritualized poses, suggesting that the act of displaying martial strength was as significant as the battles themselves. These carvings frame the warrior role within a broader cultural narrative, associating valor with legitimacy and authority. The social world surrounding warfare extended far beyond the battlefield. Hospitality played an essential role in political life, with feasting and gift-giving reinforcing alliances and obligations. A leader's ability to host, protect, and reward followers was a key measure of influence. Raiding, an intermittent, strategic practice common across early medieval societies, offered opportunities to demonstrate prowess, redistribute wealth, and settle or provoke disputes. These actions were not isolated events. They shaped networks of loyalty that sustained kingships and regional power blocks. Warfare carried ritual dimensions as well. Weapons might be offered to deities or ancestors, and victories could be commemorated through symbolic carvings rather than written records. By representing warriors on stone, communities preserved not the details of conflict, but the ideals associated with it: courage, leadership, and continuity of lineage. Such depictions elevated martial identity into a cultural emblem, affirming the warrior's place within both society and memory. Why then do Pictish stones show warriors not in the chaos of battle, but in ritualized, composed arrangements? The answer may lie in how the Picts understood the political and symbolic weight of warfare. Rather than capturing fleeting moments of violence, they carved enduring statements of status and legitimacy. These images were not mere illustrations, they were declarations, visual affirmations of social order, power, and the moral authority required to rule. Within this framework, the warrior becomes more than a fighter. He stands as a bridge between the practical needs of defense and the symbolic demands of governance. His presence on stone signifies stability, continuity, and the capacity to protect and lead. As we trace the lines carved centuries ago, we see not only weapons and poses, but the quiet architecture of power, a society where martial identity shaped politics, ritual, and the stories a people chose to leave etched in the land itself. Among the most intriguing features of early Pictish society is the suggestion that royal authority could pass through the maternal line. This idea, preserved most famously in Bede's ecclesiastical history, has long captured the imagination of historians. Bede recounts that the Picts, upon settling in their northern lands, received wives from Ireland on the condition that kingship would be traced through women. Whether this reflects historical reality or a stylized explanation, it opens a window onto a social structure markedly different from many of its contemporaries. It implies that women of high status held positions of influence within networks of kinship, alliance, and inheritance. Royal marriage alliances further highlight the importance of elite women in political life. By uniting powerful families across regions, these marriages shaped the stability and reach of early kingdoms. A queen's lineage could legitimize her husband's rule or strengthen claims to contested territories. In societies where written records were sparse, such alliances were remembered in genealogies and oral tradition, becoming anchors of political continuity. The prominence of women in these lineages suggests that their identities carried substantial weight, reinforcing ties that extended beyond immediate kin. Yet the concept of strict matrilineal remains debated. Scholars such as James E. Fraser argue for a more blended system in which both maternal and paternal lines played roles in determining succession. Maternal connections may have served as a stabilizing counterbalance to shifting paternal claims, ensuring that kingship was not solely dependent on military success or territorial control. This dual emphasis on lineage could help explain the flexibility and resilience of Pictish governance, allowing for both continuity and adaptation across generations. Genealogical studies from northern Britain lend further nuance. They reveal patterns where descent through the mother's family could enhance a king's legitimacy, especially in periods of political tension or regional fragmentation. Elite women thus served not only as conduits of succession, but also as symbols of unity, linking distant clans and territories. Their status is reflected indirectly through the alliances they forged and the influence their kin wielded in early medieval politics. It is important to approach these interpretations with caution. The evidence is limited, shaped by external observers and surviving texts that reflect the concerns of later writers. Nonetheless, the recurring emphasis on women in succession narratives suggests a society that understood power as something rooted in multiple lines of descent, where maternal heritage might affirm a ruler's right to lead. How did a society described by outsiders as barbarian develop one of the most debated succession systems in Europe? The answer lies in the complex interplay of kinship, territory, and tradition. Rather than a rigid matrilineal system, the Picts appear to have embraced a nuanced model in which women of high birth held essential roles in legitimizing authority. Their presence in the political landscape, subtle yet foundational, reveals a dimension of Pictish society shaped as much by lineage and alliance as by warfare and kingship. Across the landscapes of early Pictland, traces of belief appear not in written doctrine, but in the quiet persistence of sacred places. Water sites, springs, river crossings, and locks frequently show evidence of offerings, suggesting that these thresholds between land and water held spiritual significance. Objects carefully deposited in such locations, whether tools, ornaments, or animal remains, hint at rituals meant to honor unseen forces or ancestral presences. These sites were not isolated. They formed part of a wider sacred geography where natural features shaped pathways of reverence and remembrance. Ritual structures deepen this picture. Excavations have uncovered enclosures and platforms whose purposes extend beyond domestic life, implying spaces set aside for ceremony. Though their specific uses remain unknown, their placement within the landscape reinforces the idea that spiritual practice was woven into daily experience. The presence of carefully chosen stones and arranged features reflects intention, suggesting gatherings that blended community, memory, and belief. The imagery carved on Pictish stones adds another dimension to this spiritual world. Animals appear with striking frequency: stags, salmon, birds, each rendered with symbolic precision. These creatures may reflect roles within cosmology, narratives, or clan identity, though their meanings resist definitive interpretation. Abstract symbols, such as crescents, double discs, and rods, recur across regions, forming a symbolic vocabulary that likely conveyed concepts of lineage, transition, or cosmic order. Their arrangement on stones, sometimes in balanced sequences, sometimes paired with crosses or warriors, suggests a layered system of meaning that integrated older traditions with emerging influences. Connections to earlier Iron Age rituals can be sensed in this blending. Many Iron Age societies across Britain and Ireland practiced offerings at liminal sites, revered animals as embodiments of spiritual power, and used symbolic motifs to express cosmological ideas. Pictish spirituality, though distinct, appears to have grown from these deep-rooted traditions, adapting them to new social structures and regional identities. Comparative Celtic scholarship offers parallels that illuminate patterns without imposing conclusions. Reverence for the natural world, ritual deposition, and symbolic storytelling formed a shared cultural landscape across much of early northern Europe. As Christianity spread through Scotland, new symbols entered this sacred vocabulary, yet older motifs persisted. Class II stones, bearing both crosses and traditional Pictish symbols, show how spiritual systems overlapped rather than replaced one another. This coexistence reflects a worldview able to hold continuity and change simultaneously, honoring ancestral practices while engaging with new forms of devotion. Can belief be reconstructed through symbols alone? The archaeological record provides only partial answers. What emerges is not a fully articulated religion, but a constellation of practices that bound people to land, ancestry, and the unseen. Pictish spirituality seems to have found expression not through texts, but through places, objects, and carved motifs, acts of devotion preserved in stone and soil. In their silence, these traces invite contemplation, offering glimpses of a world where the sacred was not confined to temples or scriptures, but lived in the rhythms of landscape and community. Across the early medieval landscape of northern Scotland, certain sites stand out for the concentration of power they reveal. Places like Rhynie, Burghead, Craigfadrig, and Fortiviat offer archaeological windows into the emergence of Pictish royal out. Hority, at Rhynie, excavations have uncovered evidence of an elite complex, including finely crafted metalwork, imported glass fragments, and feasting debris that signal gatherings of high-status individuals. These discoveries point to a community where leadership was expressed through hospitality, craftsmanship, and the deliberate display of wealth, markers that helped crystallize political hierarchies. Burghead, perched on a commanding coastal promontory, illustrates a different facet of power. Its massive ramparts and carved bull symbols suggest a fortified center associated with ritual significance and regional influence. The scale of its defenses speaks to the resources and organization required to maintain such a site, while its strategic location along maritime routes links it to broader networks of communication and exchange. Craigfadrig, overlooking the Bowley Firth, similarly demonstrates how geography shaped authority. Its fortifications and internal structures mark it as a stronghold from which leaders could project power across surrounding territories. Fortiviat, by contrast, offers clues to the ceremonial dimension of kingship. Rich finds, including high-quality metalwork and evidence of monumental architecture, indicate that this site played a role in royal ritual and governance. Its layout suggests a space designed not only for protection, but for performance, where leadership was articulated through ceremony, alliances, and symbolic gestures. Together, these centers reflect a shift from local chiefdoms toward more complex political entities capable of coordinating across regions. Imported goods add depth to this picture. Items such as glass vessels, fine metal ornaments, and the occasional wine amphora reveal connections that stretched far beyond Scotland. These prestige objects were not merely luxuries, they were diplomatic tools, reinforcing status and forging ties with distant powers. Their presence indicates that Pictish elites engaged actively with external trading networks, participating in the economic and political currents of the wider North Atlantic and European worlds. Through these exchanges, rulers consolidated influence, displayed authority, and strengthened the bonds that held emerging kingdoms together. Contemporary chronicles, including entries in the Annals of Tigernach and references in the Historia Brittonum, confirm that Pictish rulers were recognized players in the political landscape of early medieval Britain. These texts, though limited in detail, show kings interacting with neighboring regions, engaging in warfare, diplomacy, and ecclesiastical reforms. Their recorded deeds align with the archaeological evidence, forming a composite image of leadership that was both pragmatic and ceremonial. What turned a constellation of tribes into a kingdom powerful enough to influence all of northern Britain? The answer lies in the gradual concentration of authority within these elite centers, supported by networks of kinship, trade, and ritual. Over time, local strongholds evolved into royal compounds, their leaders transforming into kings whose influence extended far beyond their immediate territories. This maturation of complexity marked the rise of a political structure capable of shaping the course of northern Britain's history. Despite their reputation as a remote northern people, the Picts participated in trade networks that stretched across the Irish Sea, the North Sea, and into continental Europe. Archaeological discoveries from sites such as Portmahomack reveal fragments of imported glass, sherds of Mediterranean pottery, and delicate metalwork that could only have arrived through long-distance exchange. These artifacts, small in number yet rich in implication, demonstrate that Pictish elites had access to materials circulating far beyond their homeland. Their presence reflects not isolation, but integration, an economic and political entanglement with broader North Atlantic systems. Sea routes were essential to this connectivity. The North Sea, often imagined as a barrier, functioned as a highway for skilled navigators who moved goods, ideas, and alliances across its shifting waters. Traders from Britain, Ireland, and even continental ports carried textiles, metalwork, and amphorae laden with commodities valued by Pictish leaders. In return, the Picts likely offered furs, hides, crafted items, or access to local resources. These exchanges were not merely commercial transactions. They cemented relationships that linked distant communities into webs of obligation and opportunity. Stephen Mithen's work on early maritime networks emphasizes how even small harbors or sheltered inlets could anchor vibrant trade. For the Picts, whose settlements often lay close to rivers or coastlines, access to these routes provided strategic advantage. Imported goods found in coastal areas and inland royal centers indicate that trade flowed both into and through Pictland, suggesting organized redistribution by elites who controlled movement along key routes. Such circulation helped sustain political authority, reinforcing the status of leaders who could acquire and distribute rare items. Gift-giving formed an essential part of this economic landscape. In societies where wealth and authority were closely intertwined, prestige items served as markers of power. A finely crafted brooch, a fragment of Roman glass, or a decorated metal fitting could symbolize allegiance, reward loyalty, or seal alliances between distant groups. These objects, cherished not for their quantity but for their rarity, played a pivotal role in shaping political dynamics. Through them, relationships were strengthened and memories of obligation preserved. The ability to give such gifts and to host feasts where they were displayed was a hallmark of leadership. Royal centers depended on these networks for their growth and maintenance. The concentration of imported items at sites such as Rhynie and Burghead suggests that elite households managed complex systems of acquisition and redistribution. Their economic strategies involved not only local production, but also regional cooperation, long-distance contacts, and the symbolic capital of foreign goods. Even without cities, the Picts built a functioning and sophisticated economic framework, one that adapted to geography and harnessed the mobility of sea and land. How did a people with no cities weave themselves into Europe's economic web? Through fluid networks of exchange, strategic gift-giving, and the astute use of prestige goods to reinforce power. The trade routes that touched Pictland reveal a culture deeply interconnected with its neighbors, quietly rooted in the wider currents of early medieval economic life. In the quiet fields surrounding the modern village of Rhynie, archaeology has uncovered one of the most revealing windows into early Pictish kingship. What appears today as farmland once held a sophisticated complex of fortified enclosures, workshops, ritual spaces, and elite gathering areas. The Rhynie Environs Archaeological Project has brought to light evidence of a settlement whose scale and richness far exceed what might be expected from its rural setting. Together, these discoveries form a rare and vivid portrait of a political center at the heart of Pictish power. Among the most striking finds is the Rhynie stone, a carved figure bearing an axe over his shoulder. His elongated form and stylized features suggest ceremonial or mythic significance rather than a literal depiction. The stone's placement near the elite complex hints at a boundary or ritual marker, linking governance with symbolic authority. Its presence alone reshapes assumptions about Pictish art. Here, in a small northeastern valley, stands an image of power rendered with confidence and intention. Excavations have also revealed high-status feasting debris, large quantities of animal bones, charred remains from roasting pits, and fragments of imported glassware. These remnants point to gatherings where leaders hosted important guests, forging alliances through shared meals and displays of abundance. The presence of Mediterranean glass, rare in northern Britain, signals long-distance connections and the ability of local elites to access prestige goods. Feasting, in this context, was not merely celebration. It was a political instrument, binding participants together in shared experience and mutual obligation. Metalworking further underscores Rhynie's elite status. Crucibles, molds, and fragments of fine metal objects show that craftsmen worked on site, producing items associated with authority, brooches, fittings, and decorative pieces that conveyed rank. The close proximity of workshops to ceremonial areas suggests that artistry and governance were intertwined. Metal objects served not only practical functions, but also played roles in ritual exchange, gift-giving, and visual expression of leadership. The fortified enclosures at Rhynie add another layer to this portrait. Their size and construction imply a controlled space, protected yet permeable to those permitted entry. Such enclosures likely hosted important gatherings, legal proceedings, or rituals that reinforced social order. Adjacent areas of ritual activity, including carefully arranged stones and deposits, suggest that spiritual practice accompanied political life. Authority here was enacted not only through force or lineage, but through participation in shared ceremonial traditions. Why does one small village reveal more about Pictish kingship than centuries of written chronicles? Because the stones, soil, and debris of Rhynie preserve what texts never recorded. They capture the intersection of ceremony, craftsmanship, diplomacy, and daily governance in a way that chronicles, concerned with battles and lineages, rarely describe. Rhynie stands as a microcosm of early Pictish power, demonstrating how artistry, ritual, and political authority blended to form a distinctive form of kingship. In its fields, the past rises quietly yet unmistakably, revealing the sophistication of a people often described only in passing by foreign writers. The coming of Christianity to Pictland unfolded not as a sudden conversion, but as a gradual, quiet illumination spreading across the northern kingdoms. Missionaries from Iona, inspired by the legacy of Columba, traveled northward along coastal routes and river valleys, carrying with them a faith rooted in scripture, yet adaptive enough to meet diverse cultures. Their movements left faint traces in early chronicles and monastic writings, but archaeology provides clearer evidence of their influence. Through these sources, it becomes possible to trace the slow transformation of belief, governance, and artistic practice. Port Mahomac on the Tarbat Peninsula offers one of the most compelling early monastic sites in Pictland. Excavations have revealed a vibrant religious community with a scriptoria where manuscripts were produced, metal workshops crafting liturgical objects, and a church structure serving as the spiritual core. The precision of the metalwork and the presence of vellum production suggest that this was not an isolated outpost, but a center of learning and craft. Its existence indicates that Christian ideas had taken root deeply enough to support monastic life, intellectual activity, and the training of clergy. As Christianity spread, it did not erase the symbols and structures of earlier belief. Instead, a slow integration emerged, visible most clearly in the Class II Pictish stones. These monuments combine ornate crosses with distinctly Pictish imagery, beasts, warriors, rods, and discs, creating visual dialogues between old and new traditions. Rather than abandoning their symbolic language, the Picts wove Christian motifs into the fabric of their artistic identity. This blending suggests a spiritual transition marked not by rupture, but by synthesis, allowing continuity even within transformation. Political life shifted alongside spiritual change. Christian kingship carried new expectations, alliances with monasteries, participation in ecclesiastical councils, and the adoption of Christian dating systems such as the Roman calculation of Easter. These shifts aligned Pictish rulers more closely with neighboring Christian kingdoms, expanding networks of diplomacy and shared cultural practice. Yet the Pictish expression of Christianity retained regional character, shaped by local traditions and the persistence of symbolic storytelling. The question lingers: how did a culture defined by enigmatic symbols integrate a religion centered on text? The answer lies in the adaptability of the Pictish imagination, where text became essential for scripture, liturgy, and monastic study. Pictish communities embraced literacy within religious contexts. Yet outside these spaces, visual symbolism remained a vital mode of communication. Crosses were rendered with the same precision as earlier symbols, turning stone into a canvas where two systems of meaning met and merged. Adamnan's Life of Columba describes the saint's encounters with northern rulers, offering glimpses of early interactions between Pictish elites and Christian missionaries. These accounts, though filtered through hagiography, reinforced the idea of gradual acceptance shaped by diplomacy, respect, and the persuasive power of example. Through such encounters, Christianity became woven into the political and cultural landscapes of the northern kingdoms. In this gentle convergence, Pictland entered a new chapter, its identity expanding, its art transforming, its beliefs deepening under the growing light of a faith reshaping the early medieval world. As Christianity took root across the northern kingdoms, monastic communities emerged as the principal guardians of knowledge and memory. These monasteries were not merely places of worship. They became centers of learning, diplomacy, and artistic innovation. Sites such as Portmahomac, Kinnegad, and other foundations across northeastern Scotland reveal the depth of intellectual life that flourished within Pictland during this period. Through these institutions, literacy entered the cultural landscape, reshaping how information was recorded, interpreted, and transmitted. At Portmahomac, archaeological excavations have uncovered compelling evidence of scriptural production. Fragments of vellum, styluses, and tools for preparing parchment confirm the presence of a functioning scriptorium. Here, monks copied religious texts, studied liturgical learning, and engaged in the disciplined work of preserving Christian doctrine. This activity placed Pictland firmly within the broader tradition of insular scholarship, linking it to monastic centers in Ireland and Northumbria. The act of writing, though limited to specific communities, introduced new ways of organizing memory, transforming knowledge from oral tradition into enduring manuscript form. Kinnegad and other northeastern monasteries contributed their own distinct threads to the intellectual tapestry. Evidence of workshops for metalwork and stone carving indicates that these communities served as artistic hubs as well as spiritual ones. The hybridization of styles became a hallmark of Pictish ecclesiastical art. Interlaced patterns reminiscent of Irish manuscripts intertwined with the unmistakable forms of Pictish beasts and geometric symbols. This synthesis demonstrates both continuity with earlier traditions and adaptability to new religious frameworks. Art became a bridge between the familiar and the sacred, translating spiritual ideas into local visual language. Monasteries also played an essential diplomatic role. Kings relied on clerics as advisors, emissaries, and mediators. Through the exchange of letters, gifts, and religious texts, Pictish rulers formed connections with neighboring Christian kingdoms. The authority of monasteries lent moral weight to political decisions, while their literacy enabled the maintenance of annals, genealogies, and legal documents. In a landscape where written records were scarce, these communities anchored the emerging political structure, ensuring that pivotal events did not pass unremembered. Yet despite the spread of literacy within monastic circles, the Picts left behind few written records of their own in the secular sphere. Why did a society capable of producing manuscripts preserve so little outside religious contexts? The answer may lie in the cultural balance between oral and written tradition. For the Picts, storytelling, lineage, and lore continued to be transmitted orally, while writing served specific spiritual and administrative purposes. Monastic record-keeping captured moments of ecclesiastical importance, but did not attempt to chronicle the full breadth of daily life or political activity. Thus, written culture existed, yet its scope remained selective. In this selective preservation, a paradox emerges. Monasteries brought literacy and learning to Pictland, but the broader world of the Picts remains largely silent in written form. What survives instead are the intellectual footprints of communities that tended to memory with care, art, inscriptions, and crafted devotion that reflect both the depth of their belief and the subtlety of their scholarship. In these traces, the Pictish scholarly world endures, quiet yet unmistakably present. Across the rugged landscapes of early medieval Scotland, the kingdoms of the Picts and the Gaels of Dal Rhiata existed in a state of continual interaction, sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative, always shaping one another's destinies. These northern realms were not isolated worlds, but neighboring powers whose ambitions, alliances, and rivalries helped define the political map of the early medieval British Isles. Their relationship was fluid, marked by shifting borders, dynastic negotiations, and a shared awareness that strength on one side influenced stability on the other. The Annals of Ulster and Annals of Tigernach record moments of conflict that punctuated this relationship. One of the most notable episodes occurred during the reign of Bridi, son of Maelchon, in the late 6th century. Bridi, wielding considerable influence from his power base in the north, launched a decisive campaign against the Gaels of Dal Rhiata. His victory not only asserted Pictish dominance, but also signaled the emergence of a kingdom capable of challenging its neighbors and shaping regional power dynamics. Under leaders like Bridi, the Picts demonstrated strategic insight, balancing warfare with diplomacy, ensuring that victories contributed to political consolidation rather than mere territorial gain. Yet conflict was only one thread in the tapestry connecting these kingdoms. Dynastic marriages linked ruling families across the cultural divide, creating alliances that could either ease tensions or complicate succession. Such unions helped blend traditions, allowing ideas, customs, and even linguistic influences to pass from one kingdom to the other. Over time, these familial ties encouraged a sense of shared fate, even when rivalry persisted. Cultural exchange deepened this connection. Archaeological surveys in Argyll and northeastern Scotland reveal movement of goods, artistic motifs, and possibly even religious practices between the two kingdoms. Decorative styles show overlapping influences, while the flow of monks, craftsmen, and elite households suggests that neither side remained culturally impermeable. Each drew strength from the other through selective adoption and adaptation, creating hybrid identities in border regions where Pictish and Gaelic elements coexisted. Political dynamics shifted accordingly. Periods of Pictish dominance alternated with phases where Dal Rhiata enjoyed greater influence, especially when supported by powerful allies in Ireland. These fluctuations were shaped not only by military campaigns, but also by internal stability, succession disputes, and broader regional developments. As both kingdoms navigated these complexities, their actions contributed to a long, slow process of convergence, one not orchestrated by any single ruler, but by generations of interaction. How did two competing cultures eventually fuse into medieval Scotland? The answer lies in this protracted relationship, where conflict sharpened identities, alliances blurred boundaries, and shared challenges, such as external threats, drew the kingdoms closer together. Over centuries, the distinctions between Pict and Gael softened through marriage, migration, and mutual influence. By the time a unified kingdom began to emerge, their histories were already entwined, forming the foundation of a future Scottish nation shaped by both traditions. As the early medieval centuries unfolded, the Pictish kingdoms entered a transformative era under the leadership of remarkable kings who reshaped the political landscape of northern Britain. These rulers, most notably Bridi son of Bili and Nechtain son of Dirail, strengthened internal unity, asserted authority over neighboring realms, and guided their people through periods of profound cultural change. Their reigns reveal how the Picts evolved from loosely connected tribes into a consolidated kingdom, capable of standing against some of the most formidable powers of their age. Bridi son of Bili, ruling in the late 7th century, stands as one of the most influential Pictish kings. His leadership culminated in the Battle of Dun Nechtain in 685 CE, where he confronted King Ecgfrith of Northumbria. Bede's ecclesiastical history recounts how Ecgfrith, despite earlier dominance, led an overextended campaign into Pictish territory. Bridi, understanding both terrain and strategy, met him near Dun Nechtain, a location debated but broadly situated within eastern Scotland. The resulting Pictish victory was decisive. Andrew Breeze's analysis highlights how this battle ended Northumbrian expansion into the north and secured Pictish autonomy for generations. It was not merely a military triumph, but a defining moment of identity, proving that the Pictish kingdom possessed both unity and strategic sophistication. Following Bridi's era of consolidation came the reign of King Nechtain, whose influence extended into spiritual and intellectual realms. In the early 8th century, Nechtain initiated significant ecclesiastical reforms, including the adoption of the Roman method for calculating Easter. This decision aligned Pictland with the broader Christian world, signaling a desire for integration with continental and insular ecclesiastical practice. Nechtain's reforms also strengthened ties with neighboring Christian kingdoms, demonstrating that Pictish political leadership encompassed not only warfare and diplomacy, but also theological engagement. By embracing Roman customs, he positioned the Pictish Church within a respected tradition, while still maintaining distinctly local expressions of faith and art. These kings did more than win battles or enact reforms. They stabilized a political structure that allowed the Pictish kingdom to flourish. Their reigns show a balance between tradition and adaptation, retaining core aspects of Pictish culture while engaging with external influences that could strengthen the realm. Archaeological studies around Dun Nechtain and debated sites of Dun Nechtain reveal artifacts, landscape features, and place name evidence that ground these narratives in physical reality, linking historical texts to the land on which these events unfolded. How did the Picts transform from isolated tribes into a kingdom strong enough to defeat Northumbria? Through the vision of leaders who unified regions, commanded alliances, and understood the value of both cultural continuity and strategic change. Bridi and Nechtain stand as exemplars of this transformation, rulers who guided their people into a new political maturity while preserving the distinctiveness that made Pictish identity so enduring. Under their leadership, the kingdom stepped onto the broader stage of early medieval Britain, confident in its strength and clear in its direction. In the late 7th century, tensions between the expanding Northumbrian kingdom and the resilient Pictish realms reached a breaking point. Northumbria, having established dominance across much of northern Britain, viewed the lands beyond the Forth as a frontier to be subdued. King Ecgfrith, emboldened by earlier military successes, sought to impose further authority over the Picts. Yet beneath the surface of these ambitions lay a world of shifting alliances and quiet resistance. Pictish leaders recognized that Northumbrian pressure threatened their autonomy, and under the leadership of Bridi, son of Billy, they prepared for a decisive confrontation. Bede's ecclesiastical history provides the clearest historical account of what followed, though his narrative reflects a Northumbrian perspective. According to Bede, Ecgfrith launched a campaign deep into Pictish territory in 685 CE, disregarding warnings from advisors who urged caution. Bridi, well aware of both the terrain and the stakes, positioned his forces carefully. The battle's location remains debated, with Dun Nechtain Hill in Angus long considered the strongest candidate. Archaeological evaluations of the surrounding landscape reveal features suitable for an ambush. Marshy ground, rising slopes, and narrow approaches that could hinder a larger army unfamiliar with local conditions. Modern scholars propose that Bridi's forces used these advantages to outmaneuver the Northumbrians. Ecgfrith's troops, likely extended and fatigued, were drawn into difficult terrain where their formations could not hold. Accounts suggest a sudden, overwhelming assault that shattered Northumbrian cohesion. Ecgfrith himself was killed in the fighting, a loss that not only ended the campaign but destabilized Northumbrian influence across the region. Later chronicles and medieval retellings, though shaped by storytelling tradition, emphasize the scale of the defeat and the symbolic weight it carried. The consequences of Dun Nechtain were profound and lasting. Northumbrian power north of the Forth collapsed, never to be re-established. Pictland, previously pressured by its southern neighbor, emerged with renewed confidence and strategic freedom. The victory allowed Bridi to consolidate authority, foster alliances, and reshape the political landscape of northern Britain. It also signaled to neighboring kingdoms that the Picts were not a scattered people of hill forts and carved stones, but a coordinated and capable polity. Even more striking is that this pivotal moment in early medieval history was achieved by a kingdom that left no surviving written chronicles of its own. The Picts recorded their identity in symbols rather than text, yet their actions reverberated through the writings of others. Northumbrian scribes, clerics, and later chroniclers preserved the memory of the defeat, ensuring that the legacy of Dun Nechtain survived in recorded history. How did a kingdom with no written annals of its own leave such a decisive mark on the historical record? Through the magnitude of its achievement, the battle reshaped the balance of power in Britain, secured Pictish autonomy, and revealed the depth of their strategic insight. Dun Nechtain stands as a turning point, a moment when the Pictish kingdom stepped fully onto the stage of history, not by writing its story, but by compelling others to write it for them. In the wake of Dun Nechtain, the Pictish kingdom entered a period of remarkable stability and cultural flourishing. Freed from the immediate pressure of Northumbrian expansion, the Picts were able to consolidate authority, strengthen political networks, and direct their energies toward artistic and spiritual expression. The decades that followed the victory witnessed a transformation in both governance and cultural production, marking what many scholars describe as a Pictish golden age. One of the clearest indicators of this flourishing is the dramatic increase in carved symbol stones during the 7th and 8th centuries. Class II stones, those blending traditional Pictish motifs with Christian iconography, proliferated across the landscape. Their intricate crosses, intertwined beasts, and precise geometric symbols demonstrate a mastery of stone carving and a shared artistic language that reached new levels of sophistication. These stones were not random monuments. They marked territory, lineage, devotion, and memory. Their expansion reflects growing confidence among Pictish elites, who now had the stability and resources to commission large-scale artistic projects that reinforced both religious identity and political authority. Parallel to this artistic surge, new royal centers emerged and older ones expanded. Sites such as Birged, Rheini, and Forteviet developed into hubs of administration, ceremony, and elite residence. Their fortified structures, feasting debris, and imported goods reveal a political system capable of organizing labor, redistributing wealth, and sustaining long-term governance. Increased monastic wealth also fueled this growth. Monasteries, enriched by patronage and land grants, contributed to the intellectual and artistic vitality of the kingdom, supporting scriptoria, metal workshops, and the training of ecclesiastical leaders. This golden age also saw the rise of powerful rulers who extended Pictish influence beyond its traditional boundaries. Among them, Óengus mac Fergusa, Óengus I, stands out as a transformative figure of the early 8th century. His campaigns into Dal Riata asserted Pictish dominance over the western seaboard, reshaping the political map of northern Britain. Under Óengus, Pictland became a dominant force, capable of influencing not only its immediate neighbors, but also broader geopolitical dynamics. His reign symbolizes the height of Pictish political power, a moment when unity, ambition, and circumstance aligned. Why did artistic expression reach its peak during the century when Pictish power was greatest? The answer lies in the interplay of stability and identity. With external threats diminished and internal governance strengthened, the kingdom could turn its focus inward, toward affirming cultural values, expressing religious devotion, and projecting authority through artistry. Stone carving became a medium for articulating identity in ways that texts could not, blending tradition with innovation. The flourishing of art during this period reflects not luxury alone, but a profound cultural confidence rooted in political success. In this golden age, the Picts carved their presence more deeply into the land than ever before. Their symbols, fortified centers, and monastic traditions stand as enduring testimony to a kingdom thriving in the calm that followed its greatest victory. As the Pictish Golden Age unfolded, the kingdom's artistic imagination reached heights unmatched elsewhere in early medieval Europe. This blossoming of visual culture did not appear suddenly. It grew from centuries of symbolic tradition and refined itself through new religious influences and expanding political power. What emerged was a distinctive artistic language, one defined not by written words, but by intricate forms, abstract grammar, and a level of craftsmanship that continues to inspire awe. At the heart of this tradition was the development of interlace and complex animal ornamentation. Though interlace appears across the insular world, Pictish artisans transformed it into something uniquely their own, blending fluid patterns with the iconic beasts and symbols that had long defined their cultural identity. Animals on Pictish stones, elongated, intertwined, or poised in stylized motion, carry an elegance that suggests both spiritual significance and aesthetic mastery. These forms do not merely decorate, they communicate, inviting viewers into a symbolic world structured around balance, contrast, and repetition. Masterpieces such as the Hilton of Cadboll stone reveal the full richness of this visual vocabulary. This intricately carved slab, with its sweeping curves, detailed figures, and finely executed ornamentation, demonstrates not only technical skill, but also sophisticated artistic planning. Similarly, the sculptural collections at Magel and St. Vigians present a breadth of motifs and compositions that signal thriving workshop traditions. These centers of craftsmanship maintained consistency in carving techniques while also encouraging variation, resulting in artworks that share cultural coherence yet remain individually expressive. Pictish iconography during this period also embraced hybrid forms. Class II stones, combining Christian imagery with native symbols, illustrate how deeply the kingdom's artistic identity was tied to both heritage and adaptation. Crosses stand alongside crescents and double discs. Interlace merges seamlessly with narrative scenes, symbolic beasts appear in the margins of Christian motifs. This blending reflects not conflict, but continuity, a willingness to integrate new spiritual frameworks without abandoning long-held visual structures. Through such synthesis, the Picts articulated a worldview that honored tradition while embracing transformation. Behind these creations lay organized workshops, skilled carvers, and apprenticeship systems. The uniformity of technique across distant sites suggests that knowledge traveled, whether through itinerant craftsmen or elite patronage, ensuring that the language of Pictish art remained mutually intelligible across the kingdom. Stone selection, tool marks, and stylistic patterns point to a disciplined craft tradition, one supported by political stability and elite sponsorship. Why do Pictish stones seem to speak a language that modern scholars still struggle to decipher? Perhaps because this art was never meant to be literal. Pictish sculpture communicates through abstraction, symbolism, and formal arrangement rather than explanatory text. Meaning resides not in direct depiction, but in the relationships between forms, in the echoes of earlier symbols, and in the harmony of lines carved into enduring stone. In these works, the Picts inscribed their identity into the landscape with a precision that transcends words. Their art remains a testament to a nation that chose to express its deepest values through visual beauty, crafting a legacy that endures in quiet, reverent brilliance. At the height of Pictish power, when the kingdom's influence stretched across northern Britain and its artistry reached new levels of sophistication, the foundations of its political world were not as unshakable as they appeared. Beneath the surface of unity lay a landscape shaped by competing royal lineages, regional loyalties, and ambitions that did not always align with the goals of central authority. The strength of the Pictish kingdom created opportunities for greatness, but it also exposed tensions that would, in time, become sources of vulnerability. The Annals of Ulster record numerous entries that hint at succession disputes and rival claims to kingship. These brief notes, announcements of kings dying, being overthrown, or replaced by rivals, suggest a political environment where leadership was contested, and legitimacy depended on both lineage and the support of powerful regional families. Unlike societies with a strictly hereditary monarchy, Pictish kingship appears to have balanced dynastic right with the approval of influential noble factions, creating a system both flexible and inherently unstable. Competing royal families vied for influence, each seeking to place their preferred candidate on the throne. These struggles, while rarely documented in detail, can be inferred from patterns of rapid succession and overlapping reigns. Regional rivalries further complicated the political landscape. Areas such as Fortriu, Surson, and Kate held distinct identities and local power structures. Their leaders could either bolster the central kingdom through cooperation or undermine it through defiance. Unity was therefore not a permanent condition, but a negotiated achievement that required constant maintenance. Ambition, too, played a defining role. As the kingdom expanded under rulers like Óengus I, opportunities for influence grew. Ambitious nobles who benefited from the kingdom's ascendancy might seek greater autonomy or challenge the authority of the king. Others might align themselves with external powers, Irish dynasties, Northumbrian nobles, or regional rivals, to strengthen their position. Such alliances could shift rapidly, creating an environment where trust and loyalty were valuable yet precarious commodities. These internal dynamics shaped Pictish governance in profound ways. Strong rulers could navigate them effectively, using diplomacy, marriage alliances, and displays of power to maintain cohesion. Weaker rulers, however, struggled to command the same loyalty, and fractures within the kingdom could widen quickly. James E. Fraser's research highlights how the political structure of Pictland relied on balance. Central authority needed to assert leadership without alienating regional elites whose support was indispensable. How does a kingdom that thrives on unity manage the internal storms of ambition? By understanding that strength and fragility often coexist. The Pictish kingdom's greatest achievements were built upon alliances that required careful stewardship. Its vulnerabilities emerged not from external threats alone, but from the competing visions held by those within its own hierarchy. In these royal rivalries, we glimpse the human dimension of Pictish history, leaders striving for influence, families guarding their prestige, and a kingdom sustained by both cooperation and conflict. These tensions, subtle yet powerful, shaped the future of Pictland as surely as any battle or alliance did. In the early 8th century, the Pictish kingdom reached a pinnacle of ambition and authority under the reign of Óengus I, a king whose influence extended far beyond the borders of his homeland. Óengus emerged from the powerful kin groups of Fortriu and quickly demonstrated a capacity for decisive action, strategic understanding, and political insight. Through a combination of military prowess, diplomatic engagement, and symbolic leadership, he transformed Pictland into a dominant force in northern Britain. The annals of Tigernach record Óengus' major victories, beginning with his campaigns against Dal Rioter. These conflicts redefined the relationship between the two kingdoms. Óengus not only defeated his western neighbors, but also asserted lasting control over their territories, effectively integrating the region into a broader Pictish sphere of influence. This consolidation strengthened the Pictish kingdom's access to maritime routes, resources, and strategic coastal strongholds. It also altered the balance of power in the region, making Óengus not merely a regional monarch, but a figure whose decisions shaped the political landscape of the entire north. Óengus extended his influence into Strathclyde, exerting pressure on its rulers and positioning himself as a central arbiter in inter-kingdom affairs. His campaigns reflected a vision not just of territorial control, but of political alignment, securing relationships that enhanced Pictish visibility and authority. Across Britain, neighboring kings would have recognized Óengus as a formidable leader, one whose reach extended into diplomatic circles as readily as into military ones. His reign also reveals a deep engagement with the church. Monastic establishments benefited from his patronage, receiving land, protection, and resources. These investments strengthened the intellectual and spiritual foundations of the kingdom, enabling Mona Stories to flourish as centers of learning, artistry, and cultural exchange. By supporting ecclesiastical institutions, Óengus bolstered both his own legitimacy and the administrative resilience of Pictland. The church, in turn, amplified his authority through networks that extended across the British Isles and into Ireland. Royal centers during his reign became focal points of power, displaying wealth, craftsmanship, and the ceremonial authority essential to kingship. Archaeological studies of Pictish geopolitics during this period highlight how Óengus used these sites not only to govern, but to project his status. Feasting halls, fortified enclosures, and carved monuments reflected a kingdom unified under strong leadership, where political identity was communicated through architecture, artistry, and ritual expression. Was Óengus the architect of a future Scottish kingdom, or the last great ruler of a culture soon to be transformed? The question lingers because his reign stands at a threshold. He forged unity, expanded influence, and defined the contours of Pictish power more clearly than any king before him. Yet the political structures he strengthened would later merge with Gaelic elements, contributing to the formation of medieval Scotland. Óengus' legacy, therefore, is twofold. He represents both the zenith of Pictish sovereignty and a shaping force in the emergence of a new political identity. As Pictland entered its mature phase of political and cultural development, monasteries became the quiet engines driving transformation across the kingdom. These religious communities, anchored in both faith and learning, spread steadily through northern and eastern Scotland. Their presence brought new rhythms of devotion, agricultural productivity, and intellectual life, while also fostering connections that helped unify a landscape previously marked by strong regional identities. Through their growing influence, monasteries shaped not only spiritual practice, but governance, diplomacy, and cultural memory. The Tarbat Peninsula project has revealed the impressive scale and organization of Port Mahomak, one of the earliest known monastic centers in Pictland. Here, monks engaged in manuscript production, metalworking, and large-scale farming, creating an institution that blended spiritual labor with skilled craftsmanship. Their scriptorium, evidenced by vellum preparation and writing tools, situated the Pictish church within the broader tradition of insular scholarship. Manuscripts produced or studied in such centers connected Pictland with intellectual currents flowing from Iona, Ireland, and Northumbria. Other monastic sites, including Kinnadah and Deer's Den, add further texture to this expanding network. Excavations reveal agricultural estates supporting monastic life through grain cultivation, cattle raising, and storage facilities. These estates served as economic foundations, enabling religious communities to remain self-sustaining while also contributing surplus resources to regional exchange. Their productive capacity made monasteries not isolated retreats, but active participants in the economic and political life of the kingdom. Monastic influence extended into governance. Kings relied on clerics for counsel, correspondence, and record-keeping. Diplomacy frequently passed through monastic channels, where literacy and spiritual authority lent legitimacy to negotiations. In this way, monasteries functioned as hubs of communication, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Their annals, genealogies, and liturgical writings formed the backbone of Pictish memory, even if much of that record survives only indirectly through later copies or references. Artistically, monasteries played a central role in shaping Pictish Christian identity. Stone carvers and metalworkers in monastic workshops blended traditional Pictish motifs with Christian symbolism, creating the hybrid forms seen on Class II stones. Interlaced patterns wrapped around crosses, while earlier symbols continued to appear in new contexts. This artistic synthesis allowed spiritual ideas to be expressed within a familiar visual language, ensuring that Christian doctrine felt integrated rather than imposed. In doing so, monasteries extended tradition even as they embraced transformation. How did monasteries unify a kingdom whose earlier identity had been so regionally diverse? Through continuity and connection. Monastic networks bridged distances, linking coastal settlements with inland valleys, royal centers with local communities. Their shared liturgical practices, artistic styles, and intellectual traditions created a cohesive spiritual culture that transcended regional fragmentation. At the same time, their economic and diplomatic roles tied disparate territories into a larger, more stable framework. In this expanding sacred landscape, monasteries became the kingdom's intellectual backbone. They preserved memory, cultivated learning, shaped governance, and affirmed identity, quiet forces guiding Pictland into a new era of coherence and purpose. In the closing years of the 8th century, a new force swept across the northern seas, altering the course of Pictish history with a suddenness unmatched by earlier threats. Viking raiders, propelled by shifting economic, political, and environmental pressures in Scandinavia, began to strike the coasts of Britain and Ireland with increasing boldness. The annals of Ulster record some of the earliest attacks, swift, violent incursions that devastated monastic communities and exposed vulnerabilities along shorelines once thought secure. For Pictland, whose heartlands relied heavily on coastal power centers and maritime networks, these raids marked the beginning of a profound transformation. The first wave of Viking activity targeted the Northern Isles, Orkney, Shetland, and later Caithness. Archaeological studies show how Norse settlers gradually replaced or absorbed local populations, reshaping the social and cultural landscapes of these regions. Burial sites, longhouses, and material culture reveal a steady Norse presence that took hold over decades rather than overnight. These territories, once linked closely to Pictish political and economic systems, became Scandinavian domains, redirecting trade routes and fracturing long-established networks of communication. The loss of influence in these northern zones weakened Pictland's maritime reach and intensified the pressure on its remaining strongholds. Monasteries, long central to Pictish religious and intellectual life, suffered grievously during these raids. Their wealth in manuscripts, metalwork, and food stores made them tempting targets. Port Mahomac, for example, shows archaeological signs of destruction during the Norse era, its carefully cultivated scholarly world abruptly disrupted. Such attacks struck at the heart of Pictish stability, eroding both spiritual continuity and administrative coherence. Without the safety of monastic centers, the kingdom's ability to maintain its networks of knowledge and diplomacy diminished. Viking incursions also destabilized Pictish kingship. As rulers attempted to address the threat, defending coasts, negotiating alliances, and rebuilding damaged centers, the delicate balance between central authority and regional leadership came under strain. Local nobles, facing immediate pressure from raiders, may have acted independently or redirected resources to their own territories. Fragmentation intensified as leaders struggled to respond effectively to a mobile and unpredictable enemy. The same maritime routes that once connected Pictland to trade and cultural exchange now brought danger and uncertainty. Research by James Barrett on Viking economic networks reveals how Norse activities reshaped the economic ecology of the North Atlantic. Trade shifted towards Scandinavian-controlled ports, and new patterns of exchange emerged that bypassed former Pictish nodes. These changes, though gradual, undermined the long-distance connections that had helped sustain Pictish elite power. The kingdom's economic foundations grew less stable, contributing to the broader political fragmentation already taking root. Why did the arrival of Vikings coincide with the first signs of Pictish political fragmentation? Because the Viking impact was not only military, it was structural. Raids disrupted monastic centers, severed northern territories, altered trade routes, and challenged a political system built on unity and coordinated authority. In the gathering storm of the 9th century, the winds that once carried prosperity and communication now brought uncertainty, signaling the beginning of an era in which Pictland would struggle to maintain the cohesion it had achieved in earlier generations. By the early 9th century, the northern reaches of Pictish influence began to slip away under the sustained pressure of Norse expansion. What had started as scattered raids gradually transformed into permanent settlement, reshaping the cultural and political fabric of Orkney, Shetland, and parts of Caithness. Archaeological evidence, from longhouses to burial sites, reveals how the Norse established enduring footholds in these territories, displacing local elites and introducing new systems of law, economy, and identity. The Northern Isles, once integral to Pictish maritime networks, became Scandinavian strongholds, altering the balance of power across the North Atlantic. Norse settlement archaeology, supported by accounts in the Óengus saga, illustrates this transition from opportunistic raiding to organized colonization. Longhouses built in Scandinavian style, weapon burials, and domestic artifacts indicate a population with roots in Norway but adapted to local conditions. Isotope analyses of skeletons found in the Northern Isles reveal individuals who grew up in both Scandinavia and Scotland, suggesting a blended yet Norse-dominant community. These findings highlight how cultural replacement occurred, not instantaneously, but through gradual demographic and political shifts that changed the northern landscape permanently. For Pictish elites in Orkney and Shetland, the arrival of the Norse was profoundly destabilizing. Local power structures, dependent on kinship networks and control of maritime routes, were disrupted as Norse leaders established their own hierarchies. The introduction of Norse law and social customs altered daily life and political expectations. Burial traditions shifted from Pictish-style interments to Scandinavian grave goods and boat burials, marking a change not only in ritual but in cultural identity. Barbara Crawford's research on Norse-Pictish interaction underscores how deeply these transitions affected indigenous communities, leaving traces of negotiation, conflict, and assimilation. The loss of the Northern Isles carried far-reaching consequences for the Pictish kingdom. Maritime control had long been essential to Pictland's cohesion, connecting dispersed regions and enabling trade with Ireland, Britain, and continental Europe. Orkney and Shetland functioned as protective outposts, gateways to the wider world and buffers against northern threats. When these territories fell under Norse rule, the Pictish kingdom's northern shield dissolved. Communication routes fragmented, trade networks realigned, and regions once closely tied to the Pictish core became isolated or redirected towards Scandinavian spheres of influence. This territorial loss weakened royal authority by narrowing the kingdom's strategic reach. Without the stabilizing influence of the Northern Isles, central governance faced increasing challenges in coordinating its remaining territories. Local nobles, cut off from former maritime circuits, may have turned inward or sought alliances outside the Pictish hierarchy. The kingdom's political coherence, already strained by succession disputes and external pressures, began to erode further as the north slipped away. How does a culture recover when its northern shield becomes someone else's kingdom? In Pictland's case, the answer is complex. The kingdom endured for several more generations, but the loss of Orkney and Shetland marked a turning point from which full recovery proved difficult. It signaled not only a territorial defeat, but the beginning of a deeper cultural transformation as the forces reshaping the North Atlantic world pressed inward on Pictland's remaining heartlands. By the early decades of the 9th century, the Pictish kingdom faced not a single catastrophic blow, but a convergence of pressures that strained its foundations. Paleoclimatic studies of North Atlantic weather patterns indicate a period of downturn beginning in the 820s, marked by cooler temperatures, increased rainfall, and shorter growing seasons. These environmental shifts likely affected crops across northern Scotland, reducing yields and undermining agricultural stability. For a society dependent on barley, oats, and livestock fodder, even small climatic variations could ripple through regional economies, creating food shortages and weakening the resilience of local communities. Settlement archaeology supports this picture of stress. Excavated sites reveal signs of reduced occupation, abandoned structures, and shifts in land use during the early 9th century. These patterns suggest not sudden collapse, but gradual contraction, families moving inward from marginal lands, elites losing control over peripheral territories, and local economies struggling to sustain former levels of production. Archaeological traces of storage pits with limited grain deposits point toward scarcity, reinforcing the view that environmental deterioration exacerbated social pressures already mounting from other sources. At the same time, the Irish annals record a period of rapid turnover among Pictish kings. The Annals of Ulster note multiple deaths, depositions, and brief reigns during these decades, revealing a political landscape marked by instability. In systems where royal legitimacy relied on delicate balances of kinship, alliance, and regional support, such frequent changes at the top reflected deeper fractures within the kingdom. Competing factions, weakened by famine and external threats, likely struggled to maintain cohesion. Internal disputes may have intensified as leaders attempted to assert control over diminished resources and vulnerable populations. The external pressure of Viking activity, compounded these difficulties. Raids and settlements in Orkney, Shetland, and coastal regions disrupted trade routes, redirected maritime networks, and forced the Pictish kingdom to divert resources to defense and recovery. As central authority weakened, local leaders may have acted independently, negotiating directly with Norse groups or retreating into defensive postures. The cohesion that had allowed the Picts to resist Rome and unify under powerful kings now altered under the cumulative weight of famine, fragmentation, and foreign encroachment. Yet the decline of Pictland was not a sudden disappearance. Rather, it was a slow unraveling of structures that had supported the kingdom for centuries. The cultural fabric remained strong, art, symbols, and traditions persisted even as political unity weakened. Communities continued to inhabit Pictish territories, maintaining local customs and blending them with influences from Gaels and incoming Norse settlers. The transformation unfolding across the 9th century was multifaceted, a shift in governance and identity rather than an extinction of the people themselves. Was the end of the Picts a collapse or a transition into something new? The archaeological and textual evidence suggests the latter. The pressures of climate, famine, and political strain nudged Pictland toward change, setting the stage for the emergence of new kingdoms and hybrid identities. In this transition, the Pictish world did not vanish. It slowly reshaped itself, carrying its symbols, names, and memories forward into new forms that would help shape medieval Scotland. The disappearance of the Pictish language was not an event, but a gradual softening, a slow fade that unfolded across generations. By the 9th century, the final clear attestations of Pictish personal names appear in historical records. After this point, Gaelic names begin to dominate the royal lists, signaling a shift not only in political leadership, but in the linguistic landscape of the northern kingdoms. This change was subtle, not forced. It reflects a transformation in which Pictish identity blended into a broader Gaelic-speaking world rather than being abruptly displaced. In the royal courts, Gaelic gained prominence as alliances with Dáil rioters strengthened and as ecclesiastical networks favored standardized Latin Gaelic literacy. Monastic communities, long central to record-keeping, adopted linguistic practices shared across the insular Christian world. Manuscripts, correspondence, and liturgical works were written in Latin, while the everyday language of clerics increasingly leaned toward Gaelic. In such an environment, Pictish, never widely used in written form, found itself overshadowed by languages with established literary traditions and institutional support. This shift left only faint linguistic fossils behind. Place name analysis provides some of the most compelling clues to the former presence of Pictish speech. W.F.H. Nicolasen's studies identify elements in river names, hill names, and settlement names that do not align neatly with Gaelic or Brittonic forms, hinting at an older linguistic stratum. These remnants, scattered across the landscape, suggest that Pictish once shaped the way inhabitants articulated their sense of place. River names, in particular, tend to resist change, preserving echoes of earlier tongues long after spoken language has transformed. The question remains whether Pictish was absorbed into Gaelic or replaced by it. Catherine Forsyth and other researchers propose that absorption is the more plausible pathway. In a multilingual environment, Pictish speakers may have gradually adopted Gaelic for political, social, and ecclesiastical reasons, especially as intermarriage and shifting allegiances drew the two cultures closer. Such transitions are common in pre-literate or semi-literate societies, where language change follows patterns of influence and identity rather than deliberate policy. Over time, younger generations may have grown up speaking Gaelic while retaining only fragments of Pictish vocabulary in place names or local expressions. Importantly, this linguistic fade was not accompanied by a disappearance of the people themselves. Archaeology, genetic studies, and cultural continuity all indicate that the inhabitants of Pictland remained, even as their language slowly receded. Their traditions blended with those of incoming Gaels, producing a hybrid cultural world that would eventually evolve into medieval Scotland. Pictish art, symbols, and regional identities persisted well beyond the decline of the language, demonstrating that linguistic change is only one dimension of cultural transformation. How does a language vanish so thoroughly that only carved symbols remain? It fades when political shifts realign identity, when religious institutions shape literacy, and when generations choose the language that best fits their world. In the quiet merging of Pictish into Gaelic, we witness not an erasure, but a testament to the fluidity of culture, a gentle, contemplative reminder that languages live and change as their speakers do. When the political identity of the Picts gradually merged into the early medieval kingdom of Alba, their artistic traditions did not vanish. Instead, they lived on quietly yet unmistakably, shaping the visual language of northern Britain long after Pictish kings had passed from the chronicles. Stone, manuscript decoration, and ecclesiastical sculpture all carried forward the aesthetic sensibilities refined during the Pictish Golden Age. These artistic echoes reveal a legacy that endured beyond politics, its influence woven into the cultural fabric of Scotland. The continuity is especially evident in later insular art. Manuscripts produced in Scottish monastic centres display linework that bears striking resemblance to earlier Pictish designs. The fluidity of interlace, the precision of geometric forms, and the stylization of animals all reflect a visual grammar perfected in Pictland. While Irish and Northumbrian traditions contributed their own motifs, the uniquely northern innovations, elongated beasts, intricate knot patterns, and abstracted symbols, set Scottish manuscript art apart. Isabel Henderson's studies highlight how these features reveal not imitation, but the continuation of an indigenous artistic worldview adapting to new contexts. Stone carving, too, carried the legacy forward. The sculptural tradition that once expressed Pictish identity found new life in ecclesiastical settings. The St. Andrew sarcophagi, for example, preserve motifs that blend Christian narratives with linework reminiscent of earlier symbolic stones. Carved panels featuring interlace, spirals, and stylized figures demonstrate how older patterns survived within Christian storytelling, subtly bridging past and present. Early medieval Scottish sculpture more broadly retains these hallmarks: a distinct northern precision, a preference for layered meaning, and a willingness to combine inherited motifs with new iconography. Outside formal religious contexts, traces of Pictish symbolism persisted in folk motifs and regional heraldry. Certain symbols, like the crescent and V-rod or the Miriam comb, appear to have shifted from their original meanings into more generalized signs of local identity. Though no longer tied to the elaborate cultural system that created them, their visual resonance endured. They appeared in later decorative arts, community emblems, and even landscape lore, suggesting that the memory of Pictish artistry remained embedded in the imaginative world of northern communities. This continuity speaks to the durability of visual culture. Unlike language, which can fade with changing political landscapes, symbolism carved in stone resists erasure. It anchors meaning through form rather than through words, allowing each generation to reinterpret motifs without losing their essential presence. The endurance of Pictish linework and imagery reflects a cultural afterglow, a reminder of a people whose artistic contributions shaped Scotland's visual heritage in ways more lasting than their political structures. Why did Pictish symbols endure in stone long after their language and politics were gone? Because their beauty, coherence, and expressive power transcended the shifting tides of history. They offered a visual identity rooted in place rather than in monarchy, in craftsmanship rather than in conquest. In their persistence, the Picts continue to speak, not in words, but in lines carved with intention, carrying forward the quiet brilliance of a vanished kingdom. In recent years, advances in ancient DNA analysis have cast new light on the people we call the Picts, offering scientific insights that complement archaeology rather than replace it. Studies of burials from sites such as Ballinter and London Links have recovered genetic material from individuals who lived in the early medieval period within the timeframe of Pictish political power. When these genomes are compared with those from earlier Iron Age populations in Britain, a striking pattern emerges. There is strong continuity between the two. Rather than evidence of a large intrusive population, the genetic record suggests that many Pictish communities descended largely from long-established local groups. This continuity challenges older assumptions that the Picts might have been a distinct, mysterious people arriving from elsewhere. Instead, it supports a picture in which Pictish identity was primarily cultural and political, built upon pre-existing populations who gradually adopted new forms of organization, art, and belief. At London Links, where elaborately furnished burials have been studied in detail, ancient DNA indicates a mix of related and unrelated individuals, hinting at elite networks that combined kinship with socially selected membership. These findings mirror archaeological evidence for complex household structures and flexible approaches to power and alliance. Mobility, however, was still an important part of the story. Genetic signatures show that some individuals had ancestry linking them to other parts of Britain and, in some cases, to continental Europe or Scandinavia. This aligns with what we know from trade goods, stylistic influences, and historical accounts. Pictland was integrated into wider North Atlantic and European networks. People moved as traders, clerics, warriors, or artisans, weaving personal journeys into broader patterns of contact. Yet these movements did not erase local continuity. Instead, they layered new connections onto an enduring regional base. When genetic results are viewed alongside settlement archaeology, the picture becomes clearer. Long-occupied landscapes, reused hill forts, and evolving farmsteads show sustained habitation from the Iron Age into the Pictish period, supporting the idea that many communities experienced transformation in place rather than wholesale replacement. Ancient DNA thus reinforces what the stones, middens, and structures have long implied. Pictish society grew from deep local roots, adapting to new political realities, religious influences, and economic opportunities over time. Do genetics confirm continuity, transformation, or something more complex? The answer appears to be all three. There is continuity in ancestry, transformation in identity, and complexity in the ways people, ideas, and goods moved through the Pictish world. Science does not strip away the mystery, it refines it, replacing simple narratives of origin with a more nuanced understanding. In the careful comparison of genomes and artifacts, we glimpse a people neither vanished nor wholly separate, but part of a long, evolving human story written simultaneously in DNA, in earth, and in stone. These findings invite patience, caution, and humility in every new interpretation. They remind us that even precise data must be read within living landscapes. Across the windswept coasts and elevated ridges of northern Scotland, the remains of Pictish fortresses stand as monumental witnesses to a world of power, ceremony, and defense. Though time has softened their edges and reclaimed their timbers, these strongholds once anchored regional authority and shaped the physical geography of the Pictish kingdom. Their stones, earthworks, and carved symbols form an architectural legacy that reveals how seriously the Picts regarded the protection and projection of their power, even as their cultural identity was expressed more commonly through symbol rather than script. Burghead, situated on a commanding promontory above the Murray Firth, offers one of the most striking examples. Excavations by the University of Aberdeen have revealed massive timber-laced ramparts among the largest early medieval fortifications in Britain. Their scale indicates not only defensive readiness, but the ability to mobilize substantial labor and resources. Within the fortress, archaeologists uncovered a ritual well lined with carefully fitted stones, suggesting ceremonial functions intertwined with political authority. The carved bull stones found at the site, powerful and enigmatic, hint at cultic imagery associated with leadership or regional identity. Burghed was not simply a military site, it was a center where ritual, governance, and elite presence converged. Far to the southeast, Dunnottar rises above sheer cliffs overlooking the North Sea. Although better known for its later medieval fortress, the site's early phases reveal strategic importance during the Pictish period. Its natural defenses, as formidable as any man-made wall, made it an ideal refuge in times of crisis. Studies of its early structures suggest that Dunnottar functioned as a fortified retreat or ceremonial gathering place for elites, its isolation heightening its symbolic power. Approaching it requires negotiating narrow paths and steep ascents, reinforcing the sense of entering a protected, almost liminal space where authority could be performed beyond the reach of ordinary life. Beyond these iconic sites lie numerous lesser-known forts, hilltop enclosures, promontory defenses, and ring forts that once anchored local power across Pictland. Surveys by Ian Armitt and others reveal a landscape dense with fortified settlements, each shaping regional identity and contributing to the kingdom's defensive network. Some controlled river valleys, others watched over coastal routes. Many combined practical defense with ceremonial features, implying that these were not merely outposts, but living symbols of local leadership and communal resilience. Taken together, these structures form the physical spine of a kingdom whose written voice has largely disappeared. Their enduring presence reveals how deeply the Picts valued place, boundary, and visibility. They built fortresses not simply to withstand attack, but to project strength, legitimacy, and sacred authority into the surrounding land. Their walls, carved stones, and commanding positions communicate in a language of architecture that complements the symbolism found on Pictish stones. Why did the Picts build fortresses so monumental if their identity was carved rather than written? Perhaps because stone and earth offered permanence where words did not. Through these strongholds, the Picts shaped their landscapes into enduring statements of power, creating monuments that echo their vanished authority across the centuries. The story of Christianity in Pictland is not one of replacement, but of integration, an unfolding dialogue between an older symbolic worldview and a new faith grounded in scripture, ritual, and ecclesiastical authority. As Christianity spread through the northern kingdoms, it encountered a culture already rich in imagery, memory, and spiritual practice. The resulting synthesis produced one of the most distinctive ecclesiastical traditions in early medieval Europe, marked by continuity as much as transformation. The clearest expressions of this blending appear on the Class II Pictish stones. These monuments pair intricately carved Christian crosses with the symbols of an earlier age, crescents and V-rods, beasts, mirrors, and abstract motifs whose meanings still resist final interpretation. Rather than erasing pre-Christian imagery, the Picts allowed it to coexist with the cross, creating a visual language that bridged two spiritual systems. This coexistence suggests a gentler form of conversion, where new theological ideas were grafted onto familiar symbolic frameworks. In these carvings, one can sense a culture negotiating identity, a people maintaining connection to ancestral traditions while embracing a faith that linked them to the wider insular world. Port Mahomac stands at the heart of this evolution. Excavations from the Tarbat Discovery Program reveal a sophisticated monastic settlement with a scriptoria dedicated to manuscript production. Here, monks prepared vellum, copied biblical texts, and studied liturgical materials, contributing to the emergence of early Scottish literacy. The presence of workshops for metalwork and sculpture indicates that monastic life was not solely contemplative. It was a center of artistic and intellectual creativity. Port Mahomac's influence spread outward through clerical networks, shaping the religious culture of the surrounding regions and establishing patterns of ecclesiastical organization that would endure into the medieval period. Historical texts provide glimpses of Pictish ecclesiastical leadership. Adamnan's Life of Columba mentions interactions between Pictish kings and clerics, hinting at the growing importance of bishops and abbots in political as well as spiritual life. These religious figures participated in broader insular networks that connected Iona, Northumbria, and Ireland, facilitating exchanges of doctrine, liturgy, and scholarly tradition. Their presence demonstrates that Pictish Christianity was not isolated, but deeply embedded in the currents of early medieval thought. This expansion of the church reshaped governance. Kings relied on ecclesiastical advisors for matters of law, diplomacy, and legitimacy. Monasteries served as repositories of memory, recording lineages and preserving the intellectual heritage that later chroniclers would draw upon. Through these institutions, Christian identity became woven into the fabric of the Pictish kingdom, supporting structures of authority while providing spiritual and cultural continuity. How did a symbol-driven culture adapt to a faith centered on scripture and text? By translating theological meaning into artistic and architectural forms that resonated with local traditions. The Pictish Church did not abandon the visual imagination that had defined earlier generations. It reinterpreted it, allowing stone, metal, and manuscript illumination to carry the weight of sacred meaning. In this quiet synthesis, the Picts shaped a Christian heritage that would see the earliest foundations of Scottish ecclesiastical identity. As centuries passed and the political identity of the Picts merged into the emerging kingdom of Alba, their memory did not disappear. Instead, it transformed, filtered through the pens of medieval chroniclers, reshaped by folklore, and entangled with the symbolic imagination of later generations. The Picts, once active participants in the shaping of northern Britain, became figures of myth and misunderstanding, their history reinterpreted by those who sought origins, explanations, or cautionary tales in the silence they left behind. Medieval chroniclers were among the first to craft these narratives. The Chronicle of the Kings of Alba describes the Picts as a conquered people, their kings replaced, their identity extinguished. John of Fordun, writing in the 14th century, embellished these accounts further, portraying the Picts as both ancient and doomed, warriors painted for battle, cursed to fade, a people whose fall confirmed the destiny of the Scots. These writings reflect less an accurate remembrance than an attempt to justify political continuity and cultural supremacy in a newly unified kingdom. By framing the Picts as vanished, chroniclers provided a clean narrative arc for the emergence of medieval Scotland. Beyond formal histories, the Picts lived on in folklore. In the oral traditions of the Highlands and Northern Isles, they were remembered as giants who shaped the landscape with their strength, or as diminutive fey-like craftsmen who carved stones and built rocks before retreating into the earth. In some tales, they appear as nocturnal builders, constructing massive structures in a single night. In others, as fierce painted warriors lurking at the fringes of human settlement. These stories reveal how cultural memory adapts when historical knowledge fades. Details shift, identities merge, and the remnants of a real people blend with the imaginative needs of later generations. Yet these myths tell us as much about the medieval imagination as they do about the Picts themselves. When a culture leaves few written records, it becomes a space onto which later societies project their anxieties, fascinations, and desires for origin. The Picts, with their enigmatic stones and scarce textual traces, became fertile ground for reinvention. Their very obscurity allowed chroniclers and storytellers to shape them into symbols of otherness, of age-old mystery, of a past safely distant, yet hauntingly present in the carved stones dotting the landscape. The danger lies in conflating these imaginative portrayals with historical truth. Myth can obscure the lived reality of a people whose culture was rich, adaptive, and deeply connected to its land. Yet myth also preserves emotional residues, the sense of awe inspired by stone monuments, the memory of ancient power, and the lingering presence of a people whose physical works endured even as their language and political structures changed. Why do cultures that disappear from records become fertile ground for mythic reinvention? Because silence invites imagination. Where history falls quiet, memory reshapes itself into story, and story takes on the hues of wonder, fear, or nostalgia. The Picts, standing half in shadow and half in stone, became mirrors in which later generations saw not only the past, but their own need to understand it. The story of the Picts, once shaped by sparse chronicles and enigmatic stones, is being transformed by a new era of scholarship. Advances in archaeological science, digital technology, and interdisciplinary collaboration continue to challenge long-held assumptions, revealing a society far more interconnected, sophisticated, and dynamic than earlier narratives allowed. Rather than a mysterious people fading into obscurity, the Picts now emerge as subjects of an unfolding historical investigation, one where each discovery reshapes the map of the early medieval North. LiDAR technology has been at the forefront of this revolution. High-resolution aerial scanning has revealed previously unknown hill forts, enclosure systems, and settlement clusters hidden beneath centuries of vegetation. Sites once thought modest in scale are now understood as complex, multi-layered centers of political and economic life. Some hill forts show signs of extensive remodeling, indicating long-term occupation and strategic adaptation. These revelations challenge the idea of the Picts as loosely organized tribal groups, and instead point toward coordinated regional polities with substantial architectural capacity. Remote sensing and geophysical survey methods have similarly transformed the landscape of Pictish archaeology. Buried structures, homes, workshops, ritual spaces are now detected without excavation, allowing scholars to reconstruct settlement patterns across entire regions. These methods have illuminated networks connecting inland valleys to coastal strongholds, reinforcing the view that Pictland was not an isolated frontier, but an integrated cultural sphere with active exchange, communication, and governance. Symbol stones, too, have entered a new phase of study. Updated databases from projects like Northern Picts and REAP use 3D scanning, digital photogrammetry, and pattern analysis to compare carvings across vast distances. This work reveals intentional design systems, shared workshop practices, and stylistic evolutions that unfold across centuries. What once seemed a collection of mysterious icons now appears as a coherent visual tradition, adaptable yet structured, artistic yet politically meaningful. Recent archaeological excavations continue to refine our understanding. Elite complexes such as Rhynie, reinterpreted through meticulous stratigraphy and scientific dating, demonstrate ritual, artisanal, and diplomatic functions more intricate than earlier scholars imagined. Coastal fortresses like Burged, mapped through digital modeling, show expanding phases of construction that speak to long-term strategic importance. These findings overturn earlier portrayals of the Picts as culturally stagnant or peripheral, revealing instead a society responsive to geopolitical pressures and actively shaping its own destiny. Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland and other academic journals now publish studies that weave together environmental science, isotopic analysis, paleoethnobotany, and ancient DNA. Together, these disciplines show how the Picts adapted to climate shifts, mobilized resources, and maintained continuity through periods of stress. Their story becomes not one of disappearance, but of persistence through transformation. What mysteries might still lie beneath the Scottish soil, waiting to reshape the narrative again? Every new scan, excavation, and analytical technique hints that much remains undiscovered. The Pictish past is no longer a closed chapter. It is a living field of inquiry, expanding with each generation of scholarship, inviting us to look again at the stones, the landscapes, and the stories waiting just below the surface. Though the Pictish kingdom faded more than a millennium ago, its presence still lingers across Scotland, quietly woven into landscapes, place names, local traditions, and the rhythms of cultural memory. The Picts endure not as a distinct political people, but as an inheritance carried in stone, soil, and imagination. Their legacy is not confined to museum cases. It lies in the hills that once bore their forts, the rivers whose names preserve ancient tongues, and the communities that continue to honor their story. Pictish place names remain among the most enduring echoes of their world. Names rooted in early languages cling to river valleys, glens, and coastal features, their meanings often obscured, but their origins unmistakably ancient. Nicolaisen's studies demonstrate how such names act as linguistic fossils, preserving fragments of speech long after everyday language has transformed. These names shape how modern Scots navigate their landscape, subtly connecting present journeys to ancient identities. The physical monuments of the Pictish age are even more striking. Burghead's ramparts, Dunnotter's cliffs, and the carved stones of Aberlemno or Magel continue to stand as sentinels of a vanished kingdom. Historic environment Scotland's preservation efforts have ensured that these sites remain accessible, inviting visitors to walk where Pictish kings once ruled and artisans once carved. In museums, intricately carved stones, metal ornaments, and fragments of daily life reveal a culture skilled in both artistry and adaptation. These collections are not relics of a forgotten world. They are touchstones of identity, grounding Scotland's historical narrative in deep time. Across Scotland, local heritage initiatives and regional traditions celebrate the Pictish past. In Moray, Easter Ross, and Angus, community groups steward stone circles and symbol stones, hosting tour, festivals, and educational programs. Artists reinterpret Pictish motifs in jewelry, textiles, and sculpture, reviving aesthetic traditions that once flourished across the northern kingdoms. Scholars collaborate with local custodians to protect vulnerable sites, while digital archives make Pictish art accessible to global audiences. Through such efforts, the Picts remain part of Scotland's living heritage, inspiring curiosity and regional pride. Modern Scottish identity, though shaped by many historical layers, often draws upon the Pictish legacy as a source of uniqueness and depth. In literature, they appear as figures of memory; in academic discourse, as subjects of ongoing discovery; in public imagination, as guardians of an ancient northern world. Cultural identity studies note that the Picts offer a symbolic link between the land and its people, a reminder that Scotland's story did not begin with medieval kingship, but with the communities who carved their presence into stone long before. How does a culture endure not through texts, but through land, art, and memory? It endures when its marks are carved into rock, etched into place names, and carried forward by those who walked the same landscapes centuries later. The Picts survive in echoes, in the curve of a symbol stone, the outline of a fortress, the whispered meanings of ancient names. Their kingdom may be gone, but their presence remains, a quiet thread woven through Scotland's enduring tapestry. Even after centuries of study and decades of scientific advancement, the Picts remain a culture defined as much by its mysteries as by its discoveries. Their legacy is a mosaic of evidence, stones, settlements, burials, and chronicles, yet many pieces of the puzzle do not fit neatly together. This uncertainty is not a barrier to understanding. It is the very space in which curiosity deepens. The Picts invite us into a past where answers do not always present themselves. and where the unknown becomes a source of enduring fascination. Foremost among the unresolved questions are the meanings of the symbol stones. Despite extensive interpretation literature and pattern analysis, no consensus exists about their purpose. Were they markers of lineage, expressions of ritual, territorial signs, or components of a narrative system now lost? The symbols themselves, crescent and V-rod, double disc, Z-rod, Miriam comb, the enigmatic beast, are rendered with clarity yet speak in syntax we cannot fully translate. Their silence is not a failure of scholarship, but a reminder that meaning can be encoded in ways that resist easy decoding. The stones remain eloquent precisely because they do not yield everything. Another profound uncertainty lies in the structure of Pictish political hierarchy. Archaeology reveals royal centers, fortresses, and elite networks, yet the exact mechanisms of kingship, succession, governance, and administrative reach remain partially obscured. Irish annals and later chronicles offer glimpses, but their external perspectives distort as much as they reveal. Were the Picts governed by a single king at all times, or by shifting coalitions of regional rulers? How did local nobility balance loyalty with autonomy? These questions remain open, shaped by evidence too fragmentary for definitive answers, yet rich enough to inspire ongoing debate. Ritual life also lies partly beyond reach. We can identify sacred landscapes, ritual deposits, and symbolic motifs, but the inner dimensions of Pictish spirituality, its stories, prayers, cosmologies, are lost to time. Comparative archaeological methodology helps illuminate patterns, yet the specific contours of Pictish belief remain elusive. Their worldview must be pieced together through inference rather than text, through the placement of stones rather than recorded liturgy. In this absence, imagination becomes a bridge, not to fabricate, but to sense the outlines of what once was. The linguistic puzzle persists as well. Ancient DNA and place name studies affirm continuity of population, but the Pictish language itself survives only in fragments. Its classification remains uncertain, suspended between Celtic affinities and hints of older linguistic strata. Until new inscriptions emerge or new analytical methods offer a breakthrough, it will remain one of early medieval Europe's great unanswered questions. Are the Picts unknowable because they vanished, or because they chose to speak through symbols instead of words? Perhaps the truth lies between. They left records, but not in the forms later ages expected. Their legacy is carved in stone, embedded in landscape, and whispered through art rather than preserved in parchment. These gaps do not diminish the Picts, they elevate them. In a world saturated with information, the Picts remind us that history retains its sacred wonder, that mystery can be an inheritance, inviting reflection rather than demanding resolution. As the night settles and the landscapes of northern Scotland return to shadow, the story of the Picts softens once more into the mist. We began among these quiet hills and wind-worn stones, seeking a people who seemed to vanish. Yet their world never truly disappeared. It changed shape, carried forward in carvings that endure, in river names that whisper old syllables, and in the contours of fortresses still rising from the earth. Their presence lives in the land itself, steady as the tide and patient as the turning seasons. The Picts were never lost. They transformed, woven into the fabric of Alba, carried into Scottish memory, and preserved in symbols that speak without words. Their silence is not emptiness, but depth, a quiet reminder that history often continues beneath our feet, waiting to be felt rather than solved. As you drift towards sleep, imagine their world not as a vanished kingdom, but as a gentle resonance beneath the present. A footstep in peat, a chisel mark in stone, a name carried on a river's slow curve. And let one final question linger in the stillness. What other stories remain sleeping under Scotland's ancient stones, waiting for the light to find them again?